start with who I am. Tiffany Hallmark. I'm a hairdresser by trade and an educator for a color brand, but I'm also a learner of languages, and I've been fascinated by languages for a decent portion of my life. When I was little, my mom had studied some Spanish, so she gave me some phrases. I took Spanish in high school. My dad went to Bible college, so I got interested in the Greek that he was learning. I have an interest in Latin because that's also incredibly fascinating, and it's helpful with biology and anatomy and physiology, which I'm also interested in. And through the years after high school, I took a big hiatus from actively learning any languages. And about 6-7 years ago, I decided that I wanted to pick up languages again. So I started studying Spanish and German and Romanian. And Spanish and German were quite easy. Not a problem to be able to find resources. You can find all kinds of things, translations, books, websites, YouTube videos, anything you can think of, music, movies, TV shows, lots of ways to get good input. Romanian is a little more difficult. Many of the, at least at the time, many of the language learning apps didn't offer Romanian. Amazingly, Duolingo did, and that was wonderful. And so I learned a little bit about these languages through finding and searching out the standards. YouTube videos, music, movies, Instagram accounts that were not language learning accounts, just accounts that were things of interest, topics of interest, and finding that my understanding was building relatively quickly. My first experience with finding alternative ways of learning is right here. And that is, these are my resources. These are the 4 things I want to cover today. So what I mean by making friends online, when I'm making etymological dives, reading academic papers, and then connecting similarities. That's pretty, I would say, the 4 things that I do that are slightly less than the regular way to handle learning new languages, and specifically minor languages, because as of recently, I have also picked up a very minor language called Ekpe. And Ekpe is an African language from Nigeria that is really hard to find resources for. So my first is making friends online, developing friendships to encourage language development. When you live where I do, there's not as many people learning multiple languages. Being from the US, not everybody is as interested in learning any other language. They know English. They might have a bit of Spanish just for the sake of being in proximity. And we do have a decent sized Hispanic population or Spanish speaking population here. And you might have that. We get a lot of restaurant Spanish. Most people don't really understand why one, or at least in my circle, I should say, people don't understand always why I would choose to learn languages that aren't quote unquote useful. Spanish is useful. German, maybe slightly less so, but it still holds some prestige. From there, learning Romanian makes no sense to anybody that I talk to here because it's good for two countries, and that's Romania and Moldova. And then when it comes to it, that's literally only good in that one tribal area in Nigeria. So they really have no idea why one would do that. So to make friends online is a nice way to experience people that have the interest in languages. So my first point being, you're making friends, not just language partners. So while language exchange is always welcome, it's also not necessarily the goal of developing these friendships. You're learning things about people across the world, and it helps that they speak other languages too, so they can understand, like, oh, cool, let's talk, let's exchange ideas and thoughts, and finding I said here, find groups that have similar interests outside of the language. So you can enter into conversations about the topics that you actually like to talk about instead of your basics. Hi, how are you? How's the weather? Where's the train station? How do I find a bathroom? You can start going into deeper dives. I've had conversations about my work and my career, conversations about topics that aren't covered in any book. They're not covered in any presentation of, here's this vocabulary. So you can have these moments when you can say to somebody in whichever language, cum se spui, or como se llama, visagman, or is it maka word liekpe pala. How do you say this? How do you say this word? Is there a word? And because they are your friends and we share similar interests, they're more likely to be able to provide you with that vocabulary. And then when I'm saying here about interlingual exchanges are encouraged, what I'm speaking of is that you don't have to speak just one language in your friend group. You can speak multiple languages together and interleave them all the way through. So if you've come to a point where you can't remember how to say a word in one of your languages, switch to another one, say it, and if your language, your friends know a similar language or that other language, they go, oh, okay, that's what that is. And sometimes you just leave it and they just go on, or you can dive a little deeper into that word or the subject. And it's really nice to help also make these comparisons with these languages, and you're learning about your friends, and you're learning about what they do day to day, and they can learn about you. And I feel very grateful that I do have friends literally across the globe, that while I have not met most of them in person, meeting them online has been such a boon to my language learning because of the friendship, that they don't, it doesn't have that same stiffness of a language exchange or lessons or having a tutor. They're just your friends and you're just talking. And it's really a nice way to boost your confidence in your languages and to have some connection with different people, different lifestyles, different cultural backgrounds. It's really great to develop those friendships to help support your language learning. We have, as it's slowly making its way to the next slide, etymological dives. How to study word origins for meaning and understanding. You can see in the top left corner, I've taken a picture of my notebook that is for Romanian, because that's where I do most of my etymological diving. All the writing in red is Romanian. Anything in black is either English or the root. So in this case, pește is a fish, and it comes from the Latin piscis. But then there's other ones that might come from other roots, especially in Romanian. They kind of come from all over the place. With etymological dives, I say the first thing that I do is I use the dictionary, in my case, dex.ro, to find the word roots. So whatever word you're interested in, whether it's I don't know this word and I'd like to learn it, or I want to cement it into my vocabulary, is I put in the word, whatever it is, pește. In that particular example on the previous slide, it was I was trying to find the difference or where the roots came from pește, which is fish, and peștera, which is a cave. And they do come from different roots. So I look it up. I find the definition. And part of what I do to help cement the language is to try to only use the language of the dictionary. So reading the word, reading the definition, and using that solely without trying to translate it. If you come across a word that you don't recognize in that definition, then you can look that word up. I do a lot of what I call rabbit holing, which is, oh, I don't know that word. Let me see what that is. Oh, I don't know that word. Let me see what that is. Oh, I do know that word, but I'd like to know where it came from. And so there's a lot of entries that are running on a theme at a time. And the other part that I do a lot with the etymology is writing it down by hand. So I literally write out, here's the word, here's the definition, here's the root, because in the Dex, they put at the end Dean something, Dean Latin, piscis, like in the example there, or whatever, from this country, from this root, from Slavic, Turkic. I do not know for sure if other dictionaries will do this, but even if you're just looking at the definitions of the words, especially in the academic type settings where it's like, oh, this dictionary is, it's a noun, it's a verb, it's whatever, and here's what it means, and potentially it might even have where it's coming from. So you can find those word roots. You can get in there and go, oh, that actually makes sense now that I see it. I had a moment when I was looking up things that had to do with ceramics, bricks, clay, and I found the word in Romanian, oalerie. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, because oala is a pot. And then I was like, we literally call it pottery. Pottery. Oaleria. So I have these moments where it's like, okay, it actually makes perfect sense, but sometimes it's looking at the definitions, it's looking at those word roots, it's looking at the different little subtle pieces that you go, I get it. Like, Oh my gosh. And this is just a really good way to build vocabulary. I don't look at the etymology as a way to practice grammar, but it's really good to build up vocabulary, to remember how to do certain types, like, oh, okay, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. And sometimes there are interlingual connections. Certainly with Latin, we tend to, with all of the Romance languages, God dang it, have this potential to, if you can get back down to the Latin root, you go, oh, okay, great, because it's very similar in Spanish or Italian, French, Portuguese, and it is very helpful to see that, because sometimes looking at those definitions, you go, that's it. Okay, now I see how it's connected. Now I see maybe where it came from, and it's a really nice way to figure out how to a way to memorize things. It's putting it in your head and going, oh, okay, because I did do this dive, I can get the idea. And especially if the root of the word is in a language that you are also familiar with. I even look up etymology of English words. So I'm like, oh, well, why is it called that? Why is it called this? So it's a very useful tool if you can find a dictionary, and you can find a dictionary that has some small etymology, even if it is just, say, from this root, from this thing. And that really is a help to cement vocabulary and learn something new and have the light bulb moment of like, oh my gosh, I just got that. That is so cool. And then I kind of nerd out and do a little happy dance and move on from like, oh yeah, and that and that. And it's easy to, like I said, rabbit hole through finding new things out. It gives you a good dose of dopamine. At least it gives me a dose of dopamine. Helps me out that way. Our next piece here is academic papers. Using, as I say, obscure publications for clues about grammar and vocabulary. In beginning my studies of Ikbe, found it very difficult to find any resources. There were maybe 5 YouTube videos giving very basic vocabulary, how to say hello, good morning, good night, simple things. How are you? I'm fine. And in my searching, I managed to come across a number of academic publications from linguists. So, first of all, Google is your friend. If you, any language you're thinking of, that language dictionary, that language vocabulary, that language grammar, and just putting that out there, or this language words, this language conversation, whatever it is, it can lead to finding, in my case for Faye, it led to finding these very obscure publications from scholars that were published as, I want to say it was, somebody's thesis in the 1960s to write down the orthography and the sounds, and actually take to write down this language that up until then was a spoken language only. And finding these papers helps, at least from the linguist's perspective, because you see, oh, they've written down, this is the vocabulary. This is how the grammar seems to work. This is how their syntax is. This is how they tell the story. And in some cases, how you pronounce things, because there are sounds in other languages that are different from your own language. I'm still working on with Ekpe, the implosive B. I didn't even know there was such a thing, but it's there. And it's still, I can't quite make the sound. Most of the rest, I'm good. So using keywords, like I was saying, is those keywords are things like the language vocabulary, the language sounds, the language speech, the language dictionary, the language words can help you find these academic papers that will fill you to a certain degree. Like it can be, because they are linguists, it can be a little heavy on those details that learning a language isn't necessarily as concerned with, but you can pick through and find the little pieces and go, oh, okay, that's something I can use. Oh, I see right here. This is how their nouns work. This is how the verbs work. This is seems consistent that they have vowel agreement. This seems like, oh, okay, I understand now a little more about the language. And I'm fairly certain you can find almost anything, considering that Epe has no Google Translate. It's a very, very minor language. Finding the papers, the academic papers, was such a boon to my learning that I could read, like, oh, here's a list of vocabulary, here's structure, here is a in one case they put a whole story where they wrote it out in Ekpe and then wrote it out in a perfect transliteration and then wrote it out as translated so that you could understand what was being said and see how things worked. And that makes for a very good way to deep dive. It's not maybe the easiest to read through in some cases. You do have to put a little time in to understand, even just going into that academic scholarly language and go, okay, that is a lot of words. and I love words. I love getting in there and learning something new, but it can be a bit challenging just to get through it, but they are very helpful, and especially in your more obscure languages. I would guess, and I haven't tried this, that ChatGPT might also be a good way to find these obscure sources. You know, having the AI scrub the internet to find and amalgamate these ideas. But for me, it was Google. It was putting in keywords and seeing what I could find. You could even use language history, the language stories, the language people, the many different key words to look through and find papers, to find resources that you can go, oh, okay, now that makes sense. I can get into that. It was very helpful for me. And now it's partly due to the way that my brain kind of runs through things, and I can grab ideas and make certain connections, which is the next piece, which comes as, once I can get it to go here, so is connecting similarities. Now, these two pictures have nothing to do with each other, but I was using them as placeholders and it seemed nice. So here, finding a pattern to build an association with an espresso and a set of stairs up to a window. If you can come up with something, great. It's just I liked the pictures. They were lovely. I took them myself. So, but what I'm talking about here is actually finding patterns all through any language that you're learning. And patterns. So partly it's making connections across languages. So for example, in Romanian, you have a word schmecker. Schmecker kind of means tricky or, kind of a little sly, a little slick. And it comes from German, schmecken, to taste or, have a taste. And it's an interesting thing, but it's like, oh, okay, all right, I can see how that lines up. And they do their nouns like Japanese do their nouns, which is they don't have plural form. It's just a word, not a word and then the plural noun. And so that is like, oh, okay, yeah, that's across two very unrelated languages, but it clicks and you make this connection and it just lines up. And you go, once more, light bulbs and a little dopamine. Random trivia helps ideas stick. This one is one of my favorites because the random trivia in my head helped something in German stick in my head. And that thing in German is der Pony. Der Pony is what we call in the United States bangs and what a lot of other countries call fringe. And then there are other words, of course. But I was like, that makes perfect sense to me that they would call this section der Pony because the American English calls it bangs because the cut looks like a bangtail pony. Thusly, bangs, like a bangtail pony, der Pony. Random trivia helps it stick. That is something that not everybody's going to have. But if you can find these interconnected, like, oh, okay, yes, der Pony, bangs from a bangtail pony, I got this. So random trivia, like little pieces that you kind of like, oh yeah, no, that's like this other one, or that's very similar to this other thing, or oh, okay, we call this in both, making connections, making associations, lining it up with certain things, understanding also the patterns. And so building on what you already know is finding, like, if I've already studied a number of languages, I kind of start to see how grammar works. I kind of start to see how vocabulary is built. I'm kind of starting to pick up on how things go. So a simple example would be in Spanish, a lot of your stores are ia. So if you go to, the bread and baked goods, panaderia, the bread store, or the butcher's, carniceria, the meat store. And there are many more like that. And you go, oh, okay, ia generally means a store. Okay, great, I've got this. And there are others, like in German, Rei tends to, so one of my favorites, Fleischerei. That's fun. And other things like that, Bäckerei. Very simple where you go, oh, I see that pattern. When you do that, it's this pattern. This is great. Now I know if I know what that root word is, followed by, say, for Spanish, ia, I go, oh, it's probably a store of some variety. Okay, great. I've got this. And so learning how to find these patterns, learning to see when it's referring to something close to me, it ends like this. If it's something far away from me, it ends like that. If you learn certainly your conjugations and things like that, but once you start seeing the pattern or having a moment where I had a solid moment in Spanish when I finally figured out the difference between ser and estar, because it never occurred to me that estar is in the state of being, estado. And I was like, great. Once I got that, it made so much sense to be like, oh, ser, I am concrete things. You know, ser femenina, for example, very solid concrete things. Whereas estar is stuff that changes. Estoy cansada. Estoy aburrida. Is this state. And once I made the connection between estar and estado, it's like, there's the light bulb. Like, to be in a permanent fashion, to be in a temporary state of being. All of a sudden, oh, okay, I get this now. And once you can start finding those connections, and sometimes it does take a little work, and sometimes there's a lot of mental acrobatics that happen to make connections, and sometimes it's just a connection in your head. One is it's a terrible way to remember the word for cucumber in Romanian, but castravete is a cucumber. And my immediate thought, unfortunately, is castration. Take that as you will. But I remember castravete because of that. Yep, I know exactly what that is. And it's just a connection I made in my head. Some of my connections do come from my etymological dives where I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see how that works. That's perfect. That's wonderful. And sometimes there are just words that you just get. Like if you hear it used, you can't even really explain it. You just know you've got this thing. You have it sorted out. You go, oh, okay. But making these interlingual connections is the coolest thing ever to help learn things. Because you're like, oh, well, I already understand the concept in this language. Let me change and see if it works in this other language. And then, amazingly, it does. So that are. See, I can't even speak English. That's how good we're doing right now. So I just want to say thank you, mulțumesc, mekani, gracias, danke, for sitting here and viewing this. And I hope that you gained something from it.